The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Markham Hislop, publisher and journalist at Energy Media. Markham is a Canadian energy and climate journalist who conducts video interviews with global energy experts. He also hosts the Energy Talks podcast, writes the Markham on Energy Politics Analysis columns, and writes about the energy future. He is frequently interviewed on Canadian radio about energy transition issues and is CBC Radio Canada's Green Switch columnist. Now let's get into the episode with Markham. Welcome back, Dave and Markham.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Lysandra. John Pooley is missing in action again. Poor guy.
Yes, he is. Hopefully he's listening to us right now. Well, I'm actually really excited about this episode. Today we're talking about market literacy in the energy industry. And this is something we talk about all the time because we find it's such an important thing. And we find that maybe it's not as focused as it should be. So why do we need people to be educated on energy?
I'm probably going to get myself into trouble with this answer. And it'll be a little counterintuitive. But I think the focus on energy literacy is misplaced. And I hear this in Alberta all the time. You know, if they only understood us, if they only knew how wonderful our oil and gas was, they wouldn't oppose it. And the average person, almost everybody, to be honest, because energy is such a complex and technical issue that you can't expect people to understand more than pretty much what they do. If you want them to understand the electricity system and the oil and gas system and the transportation system and all of it's just overwhelming. And I've come to the conclusion after doing this for many years that really what we need are better narratives. And then within those narratives, we need to tell stories. People connect with stories. And so if we have a narrative that the global energy transition, we talked about this on the previous episode. The energy transition has now hit an inflection point, and all of these core technologies like wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles and so on have passed their inflection point. They're now competitive in the marketplace. They're expanding really rapidly. Over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to see them push the old fossil fuel-based technologies pretty much out of the marketplace, and electricity, we're going to electrify everything. That's a narrative. And then you can tell stories inside that narrative. Like I can talk about, China's rapid adoption of electric vehicles, and we can talk about the United States and how it's transforming its power sector. It's modernizing its grid. It's adopting more renewables, but it's also adopting a whole bunch of grid technologies and market reforms and microgrids and so on. And all of that fits in that broader narrative so that when people hear these stories, because they pop up all the time on social media and in the news media, they go, aha, now I have a framework within which to understand that. So you give them that narrative framework that kind of explains everything. And that really is the kind of journalism that we do at Energy Media. We don't do a lot of really detailed analysis, or we don't delve into energy news stories in great detail. What we do for the most part, because there's always exceptions, but what we do for the most part is we're kind of at that 35,000 foot level. And we're looking at the oil and gas industry. We're looking at the transportation industry. We're looking at politics and policy. We're looking at social changes. And then we're connecting the dots. And when you connect the dots for people and you do it in a way that they can, it's not really technical and detailed, and that gives them that framework, then you can make progress on changing and educating them and informing them, and you can make change. Trying to explain to them how electricity markets work and why we need to change, or why we need to build interties between the Western provinces to trade electricity, that just, their eyes glaze over and you've lost them. So I'm a big fan of narrative and storytelling, as opposed to education and energy literacy.
Markham, one of our writers that writes some articles for our newsletters and stuff, conveys the same thing. It's the storytelling that catches people's attention. So, yeah, Bob would be in total agreement with you on this one. So let's stay with that. And let's say, instead of increasing the literacy, let's talk about this narrative and the stories. Is there a role, besides media, is there a role for government, a role for end-use markets to talk about this story, suppliers? Like, where should that come from? And how would that be helpful to have a diversified group that is providing that type of information?
Well, again, in the last episode, we talked about the dearth of leadership around the energy transition. And so when I'm looking at this list, government, utilities, industry, business leaders, there's not a lot of effort being put into providing the kind of leadership that's required. So I'm a little bit lost on this. This is one where I don't really feel like I've got a good handle on who should be doing it. I know there are some think tanks in Canada. I'll just full disclosure here. We've been doing this online news for 15 years, and 13 years of it, we basically paid our bills by providing services like writing and video production. And last year we got a grant from the Ivy Foundation based in Ottawa, and this year as well. And Ivy funds a number of think tanks like Climate Institute and those sorts of things. And they do really, really good research into some of these policies. The problem is that they are talking to policymakers. That's their audience. They want to help. They want to help those policymakers understand modern industrial policy. They want them to understand the importance of clean electricity to, to the energy transition, those sorts of things. And there are not as many resources put into talking to Canadians and furthering those. Now, on the other side of the equation, there are, the incumbent interests who spend a ton of money and invest a lot of resources in furthering their narratives. And incumbents always want to impede change, right?
That's absolutely.
Yep. And so you see the oil and gas industry, they're absolute masters at the narrative business. And there's all sorts of astroturf groups and influencers who, spread misinformation and disinformation on, I could think of, I won't name names to protect the guilty, but there are lots of those kind of folks. I run into them all the time, and they're often on my threads making disparaging remarks about my journalism because they have an agenda. Their agenda is, if you believe that the energy transition is primarily policy driven, then it's climate policy, it's carbon taxes, and so on. Then if you policy comes out of politics. So if you can change the politics, then you can support a government, you can install a government, if you like, who will then change the policy.
Right.
And then you can take the pressure off the incumbents. I mean, that's essentially the strategy. And so when you have the Pathways Alliance, which is all the big oil sands producers in Alberta, advertising all over the 905 area code, about how wonderful they are lowering emissions, none of it's true. We still have, the oil sands still produces some of the most emissions intense oil on the planet. They just do it a little better than they did, 14, 15 years ago.
Right.
So, but that's not the messaging. That's not the narrative that they promote. And what they're trying to do is build public opinion for their incumbent narrative, to slow down change, to protect them from change. I often say, Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, is a big proponent, champion of the oil and gas industry. And really what she's doing is she's acting like a shield. She's trying to shield them from the disruptive forces that have been unleashed by the energy transition. And that's just a losing game. When you have disruption, when you have fundamental structural change in your economy, like you're moving to new technologies, you're moving to new markets, those sorts of things, and consumer tastes are changing, you can't fight that. You can't fight it. You have to go with it. You have to adapt your business model, or you become Blockbuster. You
Right.
become Eastman Kodak. Those are metaphors now for the inability to adapt to disruption. And that's essentially what we're doing. And we have way more of those people, those organizations, and the resources devoted to defending incumbency than we do explaining and advocating for adaptation and change that's required.
So how are we going to change that, Markham? I mean, I am in total agreement. Like, you see this all the time, and I know the work that you're doing, and in some small way, we're trying to do the same thing by having guests and trying to inform people. But how do we speed this up? Like, what do we need to do to actually change that? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I do. I think we need an air game and a ground game. So the air game is the kind of stuff I do in my journalism, right? But I don't have a platform like CBC or CTV or Post Media. I don't have that kind of a platform. So the amount of influence that I can have is limited, and so we're just looking at implementing this fall a ground game, and we're going to start in Alberta. And the idea is that we're going to get out and talk to folks. We have some presentations that I give on the energy transition and what needs to be done, and we're looking at talking to chambers of commerce. We're talking, other business groups like breakfast groups. We're talking about city, town councils, city councils, students in universities and technical colleges and community colleges, those sorts of things. Just get on the ground and get out and talk to people. And it's hard as a small organization like we are to effect major change, but I don't know what else to do. And so, since I don't have a huge platform, then I have to go talk to my readers, talk to other people, and convey those ideas in person. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to expand our social media audience, the number of our email list, that sort of thing. So expand our our air game, and then implement a ground game and just get out and talk to a lot of people. Maybe others will realize that, inspire other folks to get out and do the same. I hope that's the case. Maybe we'll come to Ontario and talk to some of your customers or your business community. But that's sort of, we're going to have to get in the trenches and put in the hard work, I guess, is where I'm coming from. Nobody's going to hand this to us. When there's a dearth of leadership, when the incumbents are as powerful as they are, the only way to change is roll up your sleeves and get to it.
Yeah, I again in total agreement. So you're looking to cross Canada. One of the thoughts I've had and is that certainly people like yourself and probably other like-minded that are neutral, meaning they're just going to give you the facts. They're not being driven by incumbents and things like that. They're just going to give the facts. And I thought sort of like the effort that was made in making the railway across Canada, sort of the last spike, taking a train across from East Coast to the West Coast or West Coast to East Coast and stopping at different places. To make it something that's unique and people are listening to. Markham, if there's any way we can help you in promoting that and let us know. I'm happy to help out in any way in that piece. I think that's what's required, by the way. So good on you on that.
Well, David, thank you. We'll tap you for that.
Yeah, please do. Okay, I guess I have one last question. What are the most misconceptions you hear in the marketplace about the energy industry?
Oh, my favorite one. I mean, there are many. Don't trust me. Think about wind and solar. Oh, intermittent, or electric vehicles. I mean, there's all sorts of myths about them. But the one that really drives me nuts is this idea that this energy transition is going to be really slow. And we have a scholar of energy. In fact, we have the foremost scholar of energy transitions in Vaclav Smil, who's a professor at the University of Manitoba. He's written, I don't know, like 36 books. His scholarship is impeccable. But what he does, and he's quite right in this, in that energy transitions take decades and decades and decades. But So if he says, well, things only change an average of 3.5%, in this particular energy system and per year. And that's just, you can't really speed it up, that there are constraints to that. All of that is true, except that the way this energy transition is unfolding, and I think this is true, what happened in the last episode, I talked about my graduate work around the transition from horses and steam to power tractors and combines in Saskatchewan. Is that it starts out really slow, like literally decades. The new technology takes a long time to get into the marketplace and become competitive. And we have early adopters. We have innovators who make up a couple percentage of the population. We have early adopters who make up another 4 or 5 or 6%, and they keep that going. They get that started, right? They're the gadget geeks who camp out in front of the Apple store waiting for the latest iPhone. Those are the innovators and early adopters. And then, but by the time it gets up the bell curve and it gets into early majority adopters, then you've passed an inflection point and you're off to the races. Well, it kind of goes really, really, really slow, then really, really, really fast for a decade or two, and then really slow again as you get to 60, 70, 80% of market share. And then that technology then takes another decade or two or whatever to kind of push the rest of the old technology out of the market. And maybe some of it won't. Like we probably will be using some amount of oil, for a long time, and some amount of gas. Some places are just going to be maybe, Alberta's too cold at 30, 40 below in the wintertime. You're going to have some gas for space heating, those sorts of things. But this is the thing that is misunderstood, is the energy transition didn't start yesterday. It didn't start in 2020. It started in like 1970s. And we're only noticing it now because all of these technologies are disrupting the energy system and disrupting markets. So really, really slow, really, really fast, and then slow. That's how this goes. And we're in the disruptive decade, the 2020s, which is the start of the really, really fast. So that would be, I think, the most common misconception about the energy transition.
Thanks for a great episode, Markham. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I would say is to find reputable sources of information. And in the journalism space, I always tell people, look at the sources. I'll talk about myself. I try to use economists, and I'm doing some work on Alberta oil and gas regulation. I took the law professors and experts in administrative law, that sort of thing. When your experts are suspect, they're not top quality experts, then you should be suspicious. So find sources of information. And Energy Media, you can find us at energi.media on the web. And then we're on social media as well, on Twitter or X, I guess it is these days.
Yes.
Facebook and LinkedIn and so on. And support those sources of information. Because a lot of it is independent media these days. It's former journalists like myself who have gone off and started their own operation, and we need support. And so that's what I would say is look for reputable sources of information.
Yep, and the link to Energy Media will be in the description of both the episodes with you, Markham, so our listeners can check that out for more. Markham. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
The issue of we're in this transition and it's about to go really fast. Like between now and 2030, if people don't get on, they're in jeopardy of not having a business or not having a business there afterwards. So the speed, and I think we say this all the time. But that needs to be understood. I think the idea, what Markham's also saying, is there's got to be a narrative and a story. So I welcome the idea of people listening to more informed, different sources, getting different people's opinion, because people tend to stay at one source and then they don't get a variety of people. I think it's really important that we do get a variety of sources to be properly informed. And then the last thing is the story. Like, it's maybe Markham, you're right. Like, we actually don't think the energy industry is complex because we live in it. But you're probably, well, not probably. We know when we talk to customers sometimes, where they get, oh, this is really exciting, and their eyes gloss over going, what's going on here? So the story needs to be compelling. It's got to be compelling to get them moving. So I think those were the three things that I captured.
Can I tell a little story before we sign off?
We love stories, yes.
Last year, I was interviewing a fellow whose name I can't remember, but he was Bloomberg NEF's head of mining and minerals, like global head, right? And we were talking about Alberta and critical minerals. And so is there an opportunity to mine critical minerals in Alberta? But then more importantly, because China controls 78% of all of the processing of those minerals into battery metals. So if you want, your lithium, you have to send it to China and then bring it back. If you want your, whatever manganese or cobalt, it's got to be processed in China. It's a huge bottleneck, and it gives China way too much geopolitical power. So we're trying to build those in, and there's a huge opportunity because there's very little, almost no processing available in North America. So I said to him, well, surely Alberta's got a decade. Right? I mean, at least till 2030. And he said, no. He said, Alberta has got a window of 2 to 5 years to get on this. And he said, the reason is because other countries, much more hungry countries, emerging economies, middle income economies, you can think of Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia would be really good examples. They've seen this coming for a long time. And they're really hungry in a way that we're not hungry. And they want it more than we want it. And so they're moving more quickly and more aggressively than we are. And of course, if you're not paying attention, you would know that. So that idea that we have only got, the window is open today, but it won't be open for that much longer, I think that is a key point. I agree with Dave, and we can't say that enough times.
And to piggyback off of both of you, for me, it's definitely the sources. That's my biggest takeaway from this episode. And something that I like actually about the transition from Twitter to X is now there's an addition, in high frequency tweets where it says readers added context, and it will tell you, oh, this image has been altered, or this isn't necessarily true, or the date stated in the photo is actually incorrect, and here's the news articles. And I think oftentimes, I'm sure I've been guilty. I know a lot of my peers and colleagues have been guilty. You read something online and you believe it as fact. But unfortunately, we cannot trust what we see online. We need to do our own due diligence most of the time, unless it's a trusted source. And I think it's always a good reminder to make sure that, before you restate something or when you're reading something, you look at it with a critical eye and really understand where that information is coming from. All right. Thank you all for a great episode.
Thank you very much for having me.
Markham, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and we'll stay in touch. Best of luck on crossing Canada, too, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts.